Hey guys, I have another video in the Working in Tech series. This time I'm going to be comparing INTJs and INFJs working together in tech. As an INTJ, I've enjoyed working with INFJs quite a bit. The similarities are striking, and I think this will be an interesting video. Before I get started, I want to make a disclaimer that a lot of what I'm going to say are just merely anecdotal observations about INFJs and INTJs, and shouldn't be taken too seriously. You shouldn't take typology too seriously. It's mostly for entertainment purposes, but I also hope that if you are an INTJ or an INFJ or know these two types in your workplace, that some of these tips will be useful for you. Let's get started. So here's a quick summary of what I'm going to talk about in this video. First, I'm going to talk about the differences in interests at work between INTJs and INFJs, and then I'm going to talk about how we approach problems differently, and then some of the subjective ideals that sort of leak into the decisions that we make at work, how we assess ourselves, our motivation for acting in a social situation, how we prefer to socialize at work, communication styles, and then finally I'm going to talk about points of harmony and points of discordance between INTJs and INFJs. And on the very last slide, I'll just give some tips that hopefully will alleviate some of these points of discordance. Let's get started. In this first slide, I'm going to talk about some of the differences in interests between INTJs and INFJs. I've noticed that INTJs generally are driven by quantifiable objective outcomes. What that means is they prefer to have some sort of metric or some sort of objective indicator to track progress, to see where they're going. So they're going to be attracted to things like metrics and things that can be measured. Even in their own personal development, they're probably the type that are most likely to give themselves psychometric evaluations just to see how they're doing, or measure their fitness goals using hard quantifiable data like their weight or muscle mass, or things like that. So they're interested in this idea that there are these goals and metrics that are quantifiable and they can be kind of fine-tuned, and so they get that dopamine kick by making changes to those metrics. Whereas INFJs have a more diffuse way of evaluating progress, and so their goals tend to be less measurable, less quantifiable, and more qualitative. And they're also interested in effects on, let's just say, the conscious side of the world. So that would mean humans and animals, and essentially feeling things, sentient things. So to give you a concrete example of this contrast, an INTJ would be interested in improving the statistical score of customer satisfaction across multiple surveys, whereas an INFJ could be more interested in actually interacting with the customers in real life and getting qualitative feedback. They may obviously convert that to some sort of quantifiable statistical measure, but their primary drive is going to be the customer feedback, the customer experience. As such, it's the INFJ's tendency is going to be more towards connection, more towards how did that person actually feel, whereas the INTJ would look at sort of a broader, more impersonal set of criteria like behavioral measurements. So INTJs are interested in data, quantities, things that really don't pertain to subjective experiences and the effects on others, and INFJs are going to be more attracted towards that. So you'll see this in roles, for example. An INTJ is more likely to gravitate towards becoming a CTO or some sort of C-level executive, where they can sort of abstract a lot of the desired outcomes, including things like team satisfaction, happiness, into measurable metrics, and they can kind of play with those at a high level. Whereas the INFJ is more likely to be in a position where they can be a team leader or a manager or some sort of VP level person who gets to interact with people and essentially build them and sort of witness the progress that other people and the rest of the company is making. So the progress for INTJs needs to be measured, and for the INFJs, they would prefer it if they can feel it. Now, this doesn't mean that the INFJs don't like metrics and numbers and stuff. They can be quite good with numbers, but they're not driven by them. So the changes in numbers are, could give them some sort of intellectual satisfaction, but it's not going to animate them. It's the direct impact on people. So things like customer testimonies or feedback tend to have a stronger effect on INFJs than INTJs. The second point is the difference between team efficiency and team culture. And what this generally means is that the INTJ will have a sort of group orientation that's focused on output. So, for example, if an INTJ understands that there are two highly dominant people on the same team, and this leads to some sort of hierarchy conflict or social unease, they will factor in how these conflict are affecting the productivity of the team. So essentially, as long as the bottom line isn't altered, the fact that these people brawl or use rough language isn't going to affect their decisions as much. But the moment they realize that these conflicts are causing delays and affecting people's energy and stuff, and then that translates to a decline in the team's efficiency, they are more likely to act on it. Whereas the INFJ, in my opinion, is more likely to value the team's culture. So in a sense, they try to sort of influence others to harmonize around a common sort of set of values or communication protocols. And what that generally means is that they will be a lot more involved in the team dynamics, how people interact with each other, some quantifiable and unquantifiable measures of social hierarchies, dominance, things like that. And they'll try to sort of optimize outcomes for everyone in the sense that they can sort of pick and choose people who they think will blend well together or complement each other or help each other grow. And they're very good at that. So they're going to be a lot more oriented towards influencing teams using persuasion and culture. Whereas the INTJ is probably just going to look at the bottom line of the team and see if they're working together or not. The INTJ is also going to use excessive logic in their approach to people. So for example, a common fallacy that you may see with INTJ types is that if they can quantify that a single person can produce, let's say, X amount per week, they would expect two of the same type of person or the same role to produce twice as much, right? It's a linear function for the INTJ. As such, they don't really notice some of the intricacies of social dynamics until it starts to affect that bottom line. Whereas INFJs generally can intuit how people's energies kind of blend together, and they don't need these sort of hard metrics to notice that some people aren't working, some people are not fitting in. Third point, the INTJ is going to see the company as a network of individuals, and what that means is they don't really feel loyal to a company. It's rare for an INTJ to be attached to the company as a sort of family or a sort of group that they belong to. It's more like a network of trust between individuals who each have their own unique value. As a result, they're going to be a lot less loyal to a company or a company's higher cause or even to the goals of the company than an INFJ would. For them, it's more of a contractual thing to function as part of a company than it is a personal thing. Whereas the INFJ, for example, is going to see things in a much more personal, family-esque way. To clarify this point, the INTJ, for example, may quit someone if they learn that the company is doing something unethical or there are just some people that they cannot work with. Whereas the INFJ is more likely to feel obliged to sort of stay with a company and sort of resolve these issues in the long term. And they're more likely to have a team spirit and a company spirit. They're more likely to associate with a brand. They're more likely to sort of see some of their managers as mentors, personal mentors. And then finally, the INTJ is going to have a colder sort of commitment, or an INTJ's commitment to a company is generally limited to the degree that it helps their professional growth. What that means isn't just status like credentials and degrees and stuff, but also just skills in the sense that they're making somewhat measurable progress, or I guess identifiable progress would be a better way to put it, in their either technical skills and interpersonal communication skills, their networking, but essentially they're future oriented towards self. What that means is they want to sort of become a more hireable, a more competent person as a result of their tenure at a company. The moment that it stops serving that, the moment a company is no longer challenging them in an interesting way, they tend to lose interest and kind of hop to a different job. It's really rare for an INTJ to stay at a bad job for a very long time. So this idea of just being a very itinerant and never really sticking to one gig for a long time is something common and something I personally relate to. I've had about 7 jobs in 10 years. With the INFJ, they are more likely to stay at a job to the extent that they feel that the family or the team, that the people that they work with are helping them grow as individuals. So you're going to see that they're going to focus a lot more. They're going to be somewhat oblivious to things like degrees or career ladders or intra-company hierarchies. And they're going to focus more on the connections they've built at a company. And it's easy for them to sort of, I guess, experience the company, especially if it's a very healthy environment, as a sort of family, so they can stay at a position for a very long time. You'll also notice this where INTJs are more likely to sort of seek out jobs based on meritocratic measure. So for example, if an INTJ is hopping between jobs, they're going to want to go through some sort of rigid, objective, meritocratic hiring process where they take tests and stuff, whereas INFJs are more likely to sort of pursue referral-based jobs. So, if there's a manager that leaves the company, they may follow with them. So there's more of a personal, family-like dynamic between the INFJ and their team and their coworkers. INTJs and INFJs tend to be interested in different kinds of problems. INTJs are attracted to complex problems that involve the use of a wide variety of skills. Generally, the novelty of a problem and the breadth of skills that it requires to solve is something that would excite an INTJ. So an example of that would be something like an engineering project. So an INTJ who doesn't know anything about electrical engineering and has a purely software background may get excited by a hardware project because it's an opportunity for them to sort of explore these skills that they don't have. So they're essentially excited by things that challenge their skill sets, and the more complex it is, so the more of their brain and the more of their diverse skill sets it requires, the more exciting it's going to be for them. Whereas INFJs tend to have a more purist approach to problems in the sense that they are less interested in constraints and the concrete facts and limitations that inform the parameters of the problem. Instead, they're more interested in an abstracted representation of it in a sort of mathematical or universal sense and trying to sort of solve it for humanity or solve it at a kind of like a mathematical puzzle. As such, they tend to over abstract. What that means is they focus on the feature of a problem and they essentially just go overdrive on that and try to solve it as if it's a universal problem. The universal tendency of introverted intuition in both of these types kind of shows in their tendency to sort of create exaggerated internal representations of whatever situation they're dealing with. In the case of the INTJ here, the INTJ is likely to over-engineer. So the representation that the INFJ creates is going to be overly abstract, which means it's going to be lossy. It's going to lose some of the important concrete details and material constraints. Whereas with the INTJ, it's going to be overwrought with a lot of concerns and a lot of contingencies because it's not just a concrete problem in front of them, but all the ways it could go wrong. So this creates a tendency in the INTJs to sort of over-engineer and a tendency in the INFJs to sort of over-abstract. So in this sense, they can sort of overcomplicate a project or any task if they're just kind of left to their own devices, because they don't really need, they can really get worked up with this inward tendency. The third point of contrast between INTJs and INFJs in their approach to problems is that INTJs are generally comfortable with having a working understanding of a system. So if they only partially understand how something works, say for example, they have to use a new programming language and they don't quite understand how it's different theoretically from the language they know. They can look at a quick start guide and browse through the syntax of the code and eventually sort of intuit enough understanding to sort of do their tasks, and they may get disinterested and forget about it after that. So in a sense, they're a little bit more pragmatic with their need for understanding, and they're okay with vagueness, ambiguity. Even if something doesn't make sense to them, they can still sort of play with it. Whereas with INFJs, I think probably owing to their introverted thinking tendencies, they seem to require a holistic understanding. So essentially, in their inner world, there's a strong drive towards creating universal representations of everything. What that means is if they're dealing with a computer or a hardware device or something like that, they have to tie it in with their understanding of physics and understanding of engineering and mathematics and all of these interrelated fields. So as a result, they may appear slower to pick up new things. But when they generally do, they end up with a much deeper and more complete understanding of whatever they're dealing with. INTJs are a little bit adulterous with their methods and approaches in the sense that they're not really ideology driven when it comes to accomplishing things. They essentially try out, hundreds of different things, and whatever sticks pragmatically is the one that they go with. So there's not really a strong attachment to methods, procedures, principles, philosophies when it comes to the how of what the INTJ solves. So they're very end results driven. Whereas INFJs like the ideal of internal consistency. So for example, they would like all of their work to be aligned with a methodology that they approve of. And so they have these sort of internal ideals of consistency that are, more or less private, that kind of guide their behavior. And so, for example, in the case of designers, the INFJ designers may have this ideal of pixel perfection on every single device. And even if it's not something required by the team, even if the other designers and the other developers are not really living up to that standard, they're still going to go ahead and push it to that, internal high quality standard. Whereas INTJs tend to be a little bit more compromising with how they approach these things. So the INTJ may still value high quality, but they will also value the compatibility and integration with sort of the rest of the product because they're driven by higher external things than just this internal feedback loop of pursuing high level aesthetic ideals. And the final point on this slide is that INTJs tend to gravitate towards engineering, architecture, essentially fields that are a little bit more interdisciplinary and involve the use of soft skills, a combination of soft skills, hard skills, a little bit of strategy. But the more of their brains they use, it seems like the better they are. So they may even sort of blend multiple fields to create a new sort of specialization. Whereas INFJs tend to have a very purist approach to learning and to problem solving. And this naturally makes them attracted to INTPs and ISTPs in the workplace because both of them are going to have an innate curiosity about solving these sort of platonic abstract problems just for the sake of solving them. And as a result, they're more likely to, in my experience at least, to specialize in understanding. What that means is that uh, they may develop very high level competencies in the areas of, say, design or mathematics or philosophy or in any of these sort of abstract fields that span multiple areas of life. But they don't necessarily care about implementing them. So they're just sort of knowing these things for the sake of knowing them. And as a result, even though the INFJ generally has a better understanding of how things work at a deeper level, the INTJ is going to be more effective in the workplace generally because they're able to sort of take a more interactionist approach to these problems. In a sense, they're playing with these problems and looking for feedback as they're interacting with them, as opposed to the INFJ who has to sort of deal with this problem of translating the problem in front of them into a familiar abstract representation in their heads, in which where they sort of come up with a perfect and sometimes ingenious solution, and then they have to then translate it back into the concrete world. So there seems to be a cost with the INFJ process when going back and forth. Regardless of these nuanced differences, both INTJs and INFJs generally have a lot of intellectual willpower when it comes to difficulties. So if they don't understand something, they're likely to just explore and learn it. They're not going to be intimidated by difficulty. They just have slightly different approaches. Both INTJs and INFJs can be quite idealist when it comes to their standards of work. And this is actually a point of bonding between them because the INTJ generally is a perfectionist. They're both introverted intuitives are quite perfectionistic in the way they approach problems. The main difference being that the INTJ is going to be energized by competence. So this idea that they can bring an idea to life. It's not just about thinking of a solution. It's also just integrating that solution into the real physical world and navigating that sort of through the constraints of time and budget and people and other teams and other interests and stakeholders. So they're going to strive for a standard of excellence. DJ's interest in something isn't just based on like the pure abstract problem that the problem poses. It can also be that the constraints around the problem can energize them. So a good example of that would be, let's say that there's a computer bug or a computer problem where it's a problem that's easily solved on a regular computer, but this company requires solving this very common regular problem in a very constrained fashion on limited hardware with a fixed budget. The fact that they have to sort of optimize that somewhat regular problem, even though it's not novel, doesn't really require invention. The fact that they have to sort of constrain that is an energizing thing for them because they're good with complexity. Whereas with INFJs, they're generally energized by this idea of vision. So what that means is their idealism, their sort of background, Keynesian idealist temperament is going to influence how they approach problems. There needs to be some sort of goal or some sort of helping humanity in some way. This idea that whatever they do, whatever they create, whatever they find is going to somehow help humanity. That's an animating thing for INFJs. For INTJs, it's so they're the things that animate them generally for INTJs is a lot more constrained by reality, by the circumstance of reality. Whereas for the INFJ, it's more by the sort of diffuse, high-level vision of how they want the world to be. A good example of this is Elon Musk. If you look at Elon Musk's obsession with Mars and expanding consciousness to another planet and thinking at this sort of like species-wide level, it's essentially dealing with the constraints of a species surviving, and these are very hard constraints of life, and he's exploring those through engineering and technical skills. Whereas with INFJs, it's more like they're going to be driven by something like a utopian society, something that's more abstract than these sort of like concrete challenges that an INTJ would foresee. So the idealism for the INTJ is a lot more grounded than for the INFJ. When it comes to work, INTJs strive for broader excellence, and INFJs strive for local perfection. So what this means is the INTJ gets a lot of reward in essentially doing things in a way that's demonstrably better, and essentially helping raising the bar for the whole team or the company or even the world. So making things easier, simplifying things in a very open, extroverted way is something that animates the INTJ. And as such, the INTJ is likely to look at processes in the world and the way things are done and feel frustrated because they don't quite meet the idealistic standards of excellence. So this is different from perfection, though. In contrast, the INFJ has in comparison, a very narrow focus when it comes to what they want to perfect. So, for example, they may be interested in perfecting the UI, the user interface of an application that they're designing if they're a designer. And they may create this perfect thing, but it may not necessarily integrate with the rest of the product. Or they may be interested in a specific ideology or a specific principle, and it can they may execute on that perfectly, but it may not relate to the rest of the world. So for the INFJ, finding these opportunities where they can bring out somewhat idealistic and celestial ideas down to earth at work is something that really animates them. The INTJ is probably going to be more conforming to objective standards. What that means is just external measurable standards where it's easy to determine if something is being met or not. So things like checklists, scoring cards, rubrics, these things make it easier for the INTJ to process what's expected of them. And so they're going to be a little bit more comfortable with employee reviews and objective goals and milestones. Whereas the INFJ is going to have selective standards. So what that means is the INFJ is going to have a similar process, but it's going to be more like, I have this idea of how design should be done. So they're going to have more of an academic built, and they're going to measure themselves against this internal high-level standard. It's subjective, but it's also somewhat humanly impossible. And they're going to pursue that more aggressively than whatever is socially agreed upon. So so as a result, some of their work may be a little bit nonconformist, and it may stand out. It may not integrate well with the rest of the team. It's a very personal thing for them. The INTJ is going to be a lot more iterative in their approach. I want to point out that both of these types are very, very perfectionistic, but I'm pointing out the nuanced differences between them. But in comparison to someone like an ENTJ or ESTJ, both of these types are going to come across as extremely unrealistic in their expectations and very idealistic. So in comparison to the INFJ, the INTJ is going to be a little more iterative. What that means is they can work with ideas that aren't fully fleshed out and essentially build things as they go. So they may not completely understand how a framework or a methodology was meant to be implemented, but they can take a watered down version of that and apply it and learn as they go. So they're a lot quicker to action than the INFJ. The INFJ is going to be a little bit more waterfallish. What that means is they're going to plan the projects in a waterfall fashion where essentially they go through a series of steps where the previous step informs the latter steps. An example of that would be the INFJ could spend months deliberating and perfecting their idea before they actually start working on it. So INTJs are a little bit more action first, get feedback, improve, whereas INFJs are, I have this vision, I'm going to perfect it, and then I may get it done. Finally, there's this issue with compliance. So INTJs are more compliant with practical, easy to do, accessible processes if they think that it makes the project more likely to happen. Whereas INFJs are going to have ideal principles, ideologies, methodologies, and they measure themselves against this ideal approach to things. So in the programming world, for example, the INTJ is probably going to experiment with multiple programming paradigms, whereas the INFJ will have this internal set of consistent paradigms and naming conventions and processes and stuff. And the closer they are to that ideal, the better they feel, right? So it's a very personal thing for them. And to some extent, the INTP also has this, but it's a little bit different with the INTPs. It doesn't have as much of a perfectionist punch with the NTPs as much as it does with the INFJs. But the whole idea is that they want to design a very perfect system, whereas the INTJs are like, I want to help improve the system. So the delta is more important for the INTJ than the final vision. But both of these types, in comparison to some other extroverted judging type, are going to be very idealistic. All right, self-assessment. How do they view themselves? How do INTJs and INFJs view themselves in comparison to other people? The INTJ is going to have this hyper self-awareness of their own assessment of their value and how they rank with others. So given that they rely on metrics and test scores and stuff to figure out where they are, their reliance on external measurement basically makes them hyper self-conscious of the value they bring to a team or to a company. And it's very common for them to actually habitually weigh themselves against others and just have a keen spidey sense of how their competence ranks with other people's abilities. As such, if they're working on something, on a project or something, they need to know that their value or their capacities are improving, they're learning stuff, but they also need to know that it's actually moving in a direction. So it's common for many companies to work on projects without it actually going anywhere. It just gets shelved at the end, and that would be very frustrating for an INTJ. So it's important for the INTJ to have some signal that things are moving along. Whereas the INFJ they tend to be they can be very competent, but they tend to be either extremely humble or unaware of their own value unless they receive feedback from their peers. And what this means is they have a pseudo-egalitarian tendency where they tend to see everyone that they work with on the same level, in spite of the fact that they can be either more or less competent than them. And they're usually more competent than the average person simply because they have that super ego internal standard just driving them to get better and better. But there's a certain lack of consciousness when it comes to their own value. As a result, they need feedback. They definitely respond positively to feedback, but they also need a little bit of encouragement to essentially assert themselves and assert their value to a company. So, for example, in a scenario where an INTJ asks for a raise, they can essentially just easily outline all of the things that they said they'd accomplish, all the things they accomplished, the value they brought to the company. It's very clear to them, usually, how valuable they are. Whereas with the INFJ, it's a little bit of, self-marketing might be a little bit harder for them, self-promotion. So they, I've seen many situations where extremely intelligent and competent INFJs just did not get promoted simply because they didn't have an assertive personality. And they have a lot of knowledge, but they don't always market it, as opposed to the INTJ, who can sort of spew out knowledge and essentially share information very easily. When it comes to feedback, the INTJ can easily deflect emotionally charged feedback, unless it comes from a trusted person. So the default position for the INTJ is going to be they're going to walk around with a shield, and they are their own worst critic. So anything else, whatever anyone else says is less relevant to the internal dialogue. Whereas with the INFJ, the mirror energy that sort of surrounds the feedback. So things like the tone of the feedback, the sort of short-term motivation behind it, can really, really affect them profoundly. A good example of this would be if a person is irritable because, if one of the people in the team is irritable because, for understandable reasons, for example, like a project is behind, or they're getting a lot of back pressure from higher ups, so they're under a lot of pressure, and they start sort of being hypercritical of people, the INTJ is not going to suffer as much because they have a sort of internal meter of where they are compared to where they want to go. And in cases where someone uses false feedback to sort of hurt their feelings or something, they can always examine it, but it's not going to cut very deep for them unless it comes from a respected source. Whereas the INFJ, regardless of the content of the feedback, the emotional wrap around it is going to have more of an effect on them. When it comes to problems, the INTJs are going to be the squeaky wheel. So if there are any sort of problems where, let's just say there's a boss who's mistreating people, or any sort of issues that are essentially any kind of elephants in the room, the INTJ is going to be very open about it, regardless of rank or hierarchy. And essentially this gives them a somewhat indifferent vibe, but they're also they're okay with being confrontational about problems in the team dynamics. Whereas INFJs may wait for the proper channel and proper opportunity, and this is generally wiser, and sort of keep the harmony in the team. So it's more common for an INFJ to sort of sit on a problem and wait weeks to talk to a manager about it than, say, an INTJ who's more likely to sort of address the problem head on. And then finally, about being liked, the INTJ wants to be useful, and they want their competence to be recognized. Whereas the INFJ wants to feel valued. So what that means is the INTJ can be in a scenario where they're bringing value to a team that may not necessarily experience it. So a good example of this would be someone like a janitor who comes in at night and cleans the computers and reduces the infectious disease rate at a workplace significantly. And they're going to have an internal drive to essentially they're more useful. They're bringing value. They know it, and it's an internal reward for them generally, as long as they feel like they're contributing value. Direct acknowledgement is not as important for them. So the motto here would be, I want to be very capable and useful. Whereas with the INFJ, they need to feel valued. What that means is if they're in a situation where it's mostly other TJs in the team, and there isn't any sort of protocol for soft feedback or encouragement or acknowledgement, or essentially just giving kudos to each other. If there isn't really a channel for that, they can kind of feel dry. They can feel like a lot of their effort isn't being acknowledged because their feeling tendency tends to be pointed outwards. So they need to feel like they belong to a team, and that their teammates generally like them. It matters to them that they're liked. Whereas the INTJs also have that sort of baseline human tendency to want to be liked, but it's a lot less important than feeling useful. A good way to sort of contrast this would be an INTJ would generally prefer honest but hurtful feedback if they're doing something wrong, and an INFJ would prefer sort of they would still like to have feedback if they're sort of ready to integrate it, except they would like it sort of delivered with care, and it's important to them that there's not any sort of harsh intent behind it. So that's another point of contrast, is the INTJ just kind of comes across as more self-assured and generally tolerant of conflict in sort of high energy situations, and at least in comparison with the INFJ. Driving force. So for the INTJ, they're going to monitor their passions excessively. Their self-awareness is generally deep enough that they know exactly where they want to be in a few years at a job, and they know exactly what they want from a job, a relationship, a working relationship, a personal relationship. So there's this idea of having an internal monitor that's kind of weighing how the world weighs against their personal goals and interests and values. So there's a sense of just actively monitoring. It's sort of like an expanded consciousness, where it's just metacognitive process that's like always watching and looking for signals of change, weighing things, seeing how things affect them, and sometimes they may even encounter changes somewhat spontaneously, as opposed, they call it perspective shift, but they need to feel internally aligned. So they're very much in touch with their individual passions, their interests, and the moment a company or a team kind of veers away from that, and they're convinced that it's not going to work out, they will leave promptly. At least that's been my experience. Whereas with the INFJ, they would like to work in an environment where it's possible for them to harmonize with the teams and company's tempo. So they can still have individual passions and interests, but it's not they're willing to sort of compromise with that and sort of meld it or harmonize it with their surroundings. So if they feel like the ship they're on is heading in the right direction, and if they're convinced by it, they can be really hardworking and driven. Whereas with the INTJ, given that it's a very individual thing, their interests may change. They probably have a long running internal process that spans years or maybe decades about what they want from life, and so that tends to be the sort of the main influencer. Harmony is better. I would say that harmony is probably preferred over disharmony. Nobody likes to work in a chaotic environment, but that's not the primary drive for the INTJ. Even though the INTJ is fairly stable in comparison to, say, like a P type, they tend to have these sort of bursts of energy where they can be sort of possessed by work and sacrifice their personal health, hygiene, any other considerations once they're fixed on a goal, and they get in this sort of obsessive execution mode. And I've observed that some of the older INTJs that I've worked with tend to have bad posture or tend to have physical problems just out of neglect, or they may be unaware of, they may not have developed their social skills and stuff, but they're generally hyper-focused on whatever they're working on and very driven. So it leads to sort of this state of, complete commitment, hyper-focus, and so they tend to be a little bit more bipolar than the INFJs. The INFJs, when it comes to work, as long as the emotional environment around them is fine and they're healthy, they tend to be very rational and stable. So they can understand that if not everything that they work on is going to align with their personal interests, and they can generally conform with they're a little bit more practical when it comes to sort of compromising to fit in, and they may also feel a little bit more value bound or loyal to the company. So if someone has to do work and nobody else wants to do it, and they have the energy to do it, they might just pick it up and do it. And their energy tends to be low but steady. So I've noticed that INTJs have somewhat of at least more of the type A ones, at least have these energy cycles where they go through peak productivity for something they care about, and once they release it or once they hit a milestone, they kind of need to rest. So they kind of think and work in sprints, and so they tend to be aware of their energy cycles. There's a certain seasonality that I've observed with INTJs, whereas with INFJs, they can be very steady and stable and really provide consistent output for a very long time. Some of the INFJs I worked with were engineers, had worked at the company for eight years until they got laid off, and they were always that one reliable person who always committed to a reasonable amount of work and finished it. But they never really exceeded. It was never really a passionate personal thing for them. They're generally better at balancing work, health, and social life, whereas INTJs have a tendency to sacrifice these things for higher goals. Finally, they can INTJs tend to work in short sprints, so even their thinking tends to be a little bit more fragmented than INFJs. And this generally means that they like some sort of iterative process. So like a good example of that would be like the scientific method, where they generate a bunch of hypotheses, they test these hypotheses, form a theory, and then just essentially engage in this loop. And they need that sort of interaction with the real world to essentially guide their thinking. Whereas INFJs have this ability to sort of abstract a problem away from, let's just say, the facts of the situation and dwell on it for a very long time. So I've noticed that INFJs can have these interests that span months and years, and as far as the short-term need for that problem, it's already disappeared, but they can sort of like hold on to it and dwell on it for a long time. And they kind of have that INTP-esque fascination with ideas, so they may even sort of take it up as a side project if it's something that animates them. So they essentially look at work very differently. So the INTJ is going to be want to seek alignment with their individual goals for themselves and their values with work, and it's go 100%, 100 miles an hour or nothing, right? So it's a little bit more bipolar with the INTJs. With the INFJs, it's more like work is just a necessary evil, and they're interested in problems, stimulating sort of intellectual puzzles and problems, and they can dwell on them for a very long time. And if the job provides that to some extent, along with a healthy working environment, that's very ideal for them. But they understand the sort of SJ necessity of work a little bit more, so they tend to be more practical. I haven't encountered as many INFJs complaining about their jobs or their companies or how their companies work. In fact, a lot of them seem somewhat oblivious about how the company works, how it generates money, the business structure. Essentially, it's just a job for them. Whereas INTJs, again, they're a lot more concerned with internal alignment, so they're going to be hyper aware of these things. All right, social style. How do they like to socialize? INTJs like to compartmentalize their social and work life. They don't like to mingle with coworkers unless they have to. Generally, what I've noticed is They tend to provide a sort of professional, formal interface when they're dealing with their coworkers, their managers, and it's very rare for them to share personal details or personal events, unless it's, and usually when they do it, it's sort of to, to practice social engagement, or it seems like there's an intention behind it, but generally they're very private people. And so it's, for a lot of the INTJs that I work with, unless I befriended them, they never really revealed anything about their marital status, where they lived, where they were born. In fact, they any sort of questions to sort of like break the ice about these issues can even prompt a somewhat negative response where they get kind of paranoid. So they tend to be very conservative with sharing their social life and everything that's going on in their lives. Whereas with the INFJs, they're open to integrating, and this kind of goes with the social personal life balance, but they're open to sort of integrating their personal and work life. And they're very likely to make friends at work. They're very likely to have a group of people that they have lunch with consistently, and would sort of support. And this generally means that it's possible for work relationships, to turn into something more. So a lot of their friends could be people they work with, and this sort of openness to integrating personal and work life is going to make them want to sort of disclose more personal details about themselves. So they're more likely to share anecdotes from their lives to ease tension. For example, if someone is having a problem and they share that in a meeting, they're probably going to sort of try to help that person feel better by sharing a similar problem that they've encountered themselves. The INTJ is going to, another point is, just as far as appearances go, the INTJ is going to have a very strict, serious, and professional persona. What that means is they're going to be a little bit more stoic, a little bit more likely to adhere to titles, a little bit more likely to play, some of the social games with hierarchies, for example. So they may not necessarily make jokes in meetings. They tend to be very terse, very direct, and they essentially see work as an opportunity where they're just expected to be productive. And any sort of deviation from that takes away from the productivity can be seen as inefficient, and they may disregard it. They seem, whereas INFJs are probably, next to, I would say, the ESFJs and ENFJs, probably and ISFJs, fourth friendliest type at work. So they tend to be friendly and personable with almost everyone, assuming they're healthy and agreeable, that is. And essentially, they put a lot of effort into being pleasant around people. So one of the things that I've noticed is they practice emotional hygiene. So an INTJ can sort of walk into a meeting, and if they're having a bad day or something personal happened, like their tire blew up or whatever, you're going to sense their mood, but they're not going to talk about it. So they don't really check in their emotional hygiene before they walk into a work situation. Whereas the INFJ is going to put extra effort into being more presentable and essentially not polluting the emotional environment. INTJs tend to be indifferent towards team building and extracurricular socialization. So, like I said, their engagement with their job is generally a very personal thing, a very individual sort of, tit for tat. You pay me and I work for you, and then I grow, and it's a win-win situation, right? That's kind of how they approach their jobs and their bosses. So any sort of effort to pretend like it's more than that, to pretend like the company is not just a profit-making machine, or essentially any sort of these internal team building activities and team spirit days, and a lot of the HR stuff isn't going to appeal to the INTJs all that much. They think it's excessive, and so they're not going to be enthusiastic about that. Whereas the INFJs are very much aware of the social dynamic. So even if a company says that they provide X and Y benefits to their employees when they really don't, they're a little bit more tolerant of that, and they're a little bit more likely to sort of blend in and engage in social events, and that may have to do with just social intelligence. INTJs tend to be very selective with whom they socialize with, whereas INFJs not really. Okay, the INTJ is likely to be a lone wolf, individualist, pack of one, party of one, does not like to identify with a group or a team. And so one of the potential stark differences you're going to see is an INTJ is going to be a little bit more adulterous when it comes to roles and teams. So they're not likely to stay loyal to a manager or loyal to a role or even a group. So a lot of times companies do these things where they assign like group people into teams and create false competitions, hackathons, stuff like that. And the INTJ is always going to want to lean towards doing things by themselves. Whereas the INFJ is a team player, and they really genuinely enjoy being part of a team that they love. And they see it as an opportunity to sort of connect and grow together. So they're going to want to be on a team, and they will be a hard worker, a very strong contributor. And they're okay with sort of like sharing, the rewards with other team members. Finally, the INTJ is going to be very resistant to company politics unless they're interested in company politics. So it's when it comes to social games, the INTJ is generally going to be either resistant to it, or they're going to want to use it to advance their goals. At which point it sounds that's when they engage in manipulation and stuff like that. So if rising in the ranks is something that they desire, then they can engage in company politics. But otherwise, they're just essentially resistant to it. And that can cause issues. at work. So, and this can make them sort of a black sheep. Whereas INFJs are actually able to navigate the politics somewhat intuitively if they find that it's necessary. And they can even sort of, I guess the stark contrast here would be just a level of maturity. So the INTJ is going to be, depending on their path of development, there's a subset of INTJs that essentially have a very naive sort of ideal of purity. So the slightest white lie or any sort of violation of trust could make them, could trigger them. Whereas the INFJ is a little bit more tolerant of these things. So a good motto here would be INTJs work hard, work even harder. Whereas for the INFJs, like, well, work, learn, enjoy, connect, and play harder. So there's just more skill when it comes to socialization. All right, final point. Communication styles. The INTJ is going to want to communicate using facts. So what that generally means is it's almost like they want to standardize their audience. So what that means is they don't care who's in the room. They just want to create content that appeals to a generic audience. So they're going to want to use, they're going to emphasize clarity, digestibility. They're going to want to use a more common vocabulary. So you're going to see like glossaries of definitions to make sure everyone's on the same board. So similar to sort of how INFJs approach feelings, INTJs kind of approach, there's a certain intellectual politeness that comes with INTJs where they're careful to make sure that what they communicate is clear and digestible by everyone. And what that leads to is generally they use a lot of graphs, presentation tools, so visual aids. They tend to structure their presentations in a very predictable way. So kind of like how I'm doing it now, where I just show you an outline before I go into the slides. That's a very INTJ thing to do. Whereas the INFJ is going to have more of a narrative structure. They're going to think a lot more linearly and present it even more so. So it's going to be a little bit longer-winded when the INFJ communicates. And it's important for them to sort of have some sort of rhetorical punch in their statements for them to make a point, right? So the communication style of the INTJ is basically, here are the facts. I care enough to sort of present it to you in a meaningful way, but I trust your value and intellectual judgment to decide what to do with it. Whereas the INFJ is like, well, I'm going to share this narrative structure, and I hope that you can sort of, go there with me. And it's going to be, I want it to sort of have a certain emotional effect, right? So they're trying to sort of persuade you and change your perspective. So the INFJ is going to be a little bit more strategic in how they craft their speech and how they craft their presentations. They're going to be more conscious of who's going to be watching it, what they already know, what their perspective is. Whereas the INTJ is more likely to sort of structure the facts in such a way that their arguments are very impersonal. And what that means is the INTJ does not really have a specific audience in mind when they craft their, written communication. Whereas the INFJ will have a very personal element to what they do. So the company's culture and everything is important. So a good example of this is the INTJ will bluntly criticize the company that they're working for, whereas the INFJ is more likely to polish some of the sharp edges of their speech. So the INTJ is going to have kind of a monotonic speech style where it's not. There's obviously variations between people of any type, but on average, the INTJ is going to be essentially just declaring a bunch of facts. So their speech is going to come across very declarative and very sort of, here are 8 parallel arguments, and you can take any one of them or all of them, but here are the facts, and I'm going to present to you in the clearest, most efficient way possible. I want you to decide. And they're not going to obviously tell you, they don't want to go inside your soul and change your ideas, but they want to sort of let the facts speak for themselves. So whereas INFJs are going to have, are more likely to integrate their personal experiences into the narrative, and sometimes it actually makes it more effective. Especially if they're dealing with a tougher audience, and they're gonna have a more melodic and pleasant and soft speech. They may integrate some humor. They're just gonna be a lot more. It's gonna be more of a work of art. There's gonna be a bit more of a performance to their presentation. The way they lay out information is the INTJ is gonna have very high level summaries, and then they're gonna go through each of the details. That's generally the pattern. Whereas the INFJ is going to sort of weave from one linear argument to another linear argument with a transition. So their communication style, with the INTJ, it's sort of like you have a map of the information that's being presented and you're sort of navigating it one at a time. Whereas with the INFJ, it seems like it somewhat stresses your short-term memory because it's like watching a movie or a story. It tends to be a lot more linear. When INTJs tend to be very generous with knowledge, with sharing knowledge, what that means is if you look at efforts like Wikipedia and like source sharing and open source, and a lot of these things are held together by institutions and processes that essentially provide incentives for sharing knowledge, right? So in the same way an INFJ would like to share an emotional experience, the INTJ enjoys the intellectual intimacy of a group, right? So they're going to be very strong on documentation, and they're going to be very, very strong on essentially gathering intelligence from people. So if I know several INTJs who maintain databases, like personal databases of like facts about people they know, right? So, and they may share like one or two of these facts with other people if they think that it's a collaborative thing. But essentially, knowledge is something. So the idea of aggregating and sharing knowledge with other people, including what I'm doing now, is a very INTJ thing, and it's sort of there's a subtle sort of benevolence to it. With INFJs and most introverted thinkers, including INTPs and ISTPs, it seems as though it's a very personal thing for them. So understanding their goal is having a holistic understanding of the world, really, and as such, to the degree that the progress they make, there's a sort of perpetual process where they're just refining everything they know and connecting it, and it goes deeper and deeper. And as such, it's a very personal thing, and they may not really be naturally inclined to share it. And even if they share it, it's going to be really expensive for them to sort of do that. Like it's very energy consuming for them to go out there and share their ideas in a standardized manner. They can do it on a one-on-one basis where they can sort of get the immediate feedback from another person, but to sort of just like building a wiki or building a standardized documentation is a little bit draining on their energy system. Finally, INTJs are going to deal with larger blocks, and INFJs are going to deal with abstract blocks. So INTJs are going to deal with the complexity, a very complex set of concrete details, and so their speech and their communication tends to be a lot more concrete. An INFJ will likely think that it's longer than it needs to be. They tend to be very verbose. Some of the INFJs may even find this offensive, but INTJs tend to think out loud. And the reason for this is they have this sort of broad sort of ability to be dynamic with range, so they can focus on the big picture and sort of zoom in on a tiny detail. But really, the process that animates this zooming is their contingency planning. So they're trying to account for things that can go wrong. Whereas the INFJ is going to have a more purist attitude towards these things. So they may just, if they're lucky, they may either ramble on, or they may just sort of distill the essence of an idea, and just deal with it at a very abstract level. So again, their speech is going to be a lot more conservative, especially in written communication, than the INTJ. Finally, note-taking, task managing, all that stuff. INTJs are very good at that. They can even seem a bit ISTJ-ish sometimes. The only difference being that they're only as granular as they need to be, so that they're not granular for the sake of being granular, but they can function at different levels of granularity when it comes to these things. Whereas the INFJ is just more likely to figure out, summarize the main point that sticks out to them. So they're very good at filtering ideas as it pertains to like a group's objective or goal. So their communication is going to have a higher sort of signal to noise ratio than an INTJ's. So an INTJ will sort of give you information just in case you need it. An INFJ will give you information just in time. All right, points of harmony. The things that INTJs love about INFJs, and this is going to be most of my own opinions, but the things that I've noticed are INTJs love the intellectual integrity and clarity that the INFJ brings to the situation. So both of these types have somewhat of an inward bent, but the INTJ is going to have a lot more clarity about their goals and sort of the emotional factors that are driving them in any given situation. But they may not always be conscious of any sort of internal logical glue that kind of sits behind their strong convictions. So there's this feeling of essentially lacking words, and the INFJ has the ability to sort of pierce through a situation and sort of distill the underlying abstract principle behind it. So the INTJ appreciates the INFJ's sort of ability to sort of abstract the important parts and sort of discard the rest. They also love the possibility for a shared vision. So the INTJ is it's rare for an INTJ to find a like-minded person. And given that INFJs are generally more open than INTJs, the INTJ is going to see the INFJ as their intellectual cousin. And it's possible for them both to share a shared vision, which can kind of create like a powerful pair, because one of the struggles for the INTJ in life is essentially having a vision that nobody else sees. So there's that issue of essentially having more foresight than everyone else. But if the INFJ shares that, the mere fact that they've been understood is a lot of validation for them. So that's one powerful thing. The INTJ generally appreciates the very high attention to quality that comes from the perfectionism of the INFJ. And what that means is that they recognize and feel frustrated by the laziness, both in the intellectual and physical sense of most people, really. And that's kind of what gives them the arrogance that they're known for. But with the INFJ, they find that they can sometimes just cut through the bullshit and just focus on what's important. And the fact that both INTJs and INFJs can sort of stop pretending and interact at this higher level kind of leads to this, what I call a very high bandwidth communication. So in my personal experience, when I've talked to INTJs and INFJs, I kind of I kind of use the analogy of an internet connection that's like gigabits, because there's a lot of data flowing very freely between the two minds. It's almost like there's no resistance in the medium. So there's that potential for deep intellectual intimacy with INFJs. At work, the INFJs are able to solve personal and social problems at work. So if a person, for example, is not performing because they just went through a relationship breakup, or is feeling really upset, they can go and comfort them. They can essentially sense the dynamics of what's going on. They may, for example, if the boss yells at a person, they may just kind of approach that person later on and tell a joke about the boss or something, just to sort of give them a sense of camaraderie. And they're able to navigate people and social dynamics in a very mature way, right? So the INTJ appreciates that. It's almost like the INTJ realizes that they don't have to be as irritated by people. So there's like the approach matters, and that's something that the INFJ inspires in the INTJ. Okay, what do INFJs love about INTJs? INFJs, especially the younger ones, really appreciate that the INTJs can be very articulate and can really communicate complex ideas really well. And that's something that the INFJ struggles with, because a lot of their ideas, especially if they're younger, tend to be very abstract, and they can ramble for quite some time before making a point. So the fact that the INTJ can sort of, if they share a vision, just kind of deliver that in a very concise and efficient manner is something that impresses them. The INFJ is going to like that the INTJ has a good balance of thinking and feeling. So they, depending on how sensitive they are, so if and how mature the INTJ is, there's a potential for the INFJ to sort of peek into the valuation process, and the passion and the commitment, that underlies the INTJ's drive, and that they really care. So unlike most thinking types, the INTJ is not a robot, and they are going to have a very deep care about the world. So they care about issues, they care about problems, they care about people. They just don't express it. But if the INFJ can tap into that deep well of caring, they can really feel connected to them. So they like that INTJs have a good balance of thinking and feeling, and that they tend to be really practical. The INFJs love that INTJs have a lot of drive and focus, ability to get things done. One thing that INFJs almost universally struggle with is energy. Essentially, they don't really, they're not, they're very good at ideation, but when it comes to execution, they tend to lose drive. So they're very likely to have very abstract goals that aren't really broken down into tasks or any sort of practical, without practical reach. So the fact that the INTJ can readily sort of break down their high-level vision into a structure, and then they actually walk the talk and get things done, it really, really impresses the INFJ. The INFJ appreciates the honest feedback from the INTJ. So given that INFJs are highly intuitive and they can sense malice in other people, the fact that they can sometimes, in spite of the rapping that's not always pleasant, the fact that they can sense that the INTJ means well and gives them honest feedback, that's kind of objective, is something that they value. And they like that INTJs are problem solvers. So it's kind of like a power tool. From what I understand, the INFJ's perspective is like INFJs kind of see INTJs as these sort of, like little woodpeckers at problems, and they can sort of plow through almost anything, and through very sort of creative ways. And the fact that they have a lot of willpower to sort of power through a lot of difficult problems in life really inspires the INFJ, who may feel overwhelmed by just the permutations of things that can go wrong, and they may get stuck in overanalysis and stuff like that. So that's something that the INFJ really loves about the INTJ, or so I've learned. So that basically covers the points of harmony. All right, finally, the points of discordance, the things that INTJs don't like about INFJs, and the things that INFJs don't like about INTJs. INTJs can be really frustrated by the excessive perfectionism of the INFJ. What that means is that, especially under stress, the INFJ, they're probably projecting a bit because they're seeing a bit of themselves in here, but under times of stress, the INFJ is going to turn into an excessive perfectionist. And the problem is their perfectionism is usually local. So a good example of that is if you're building a house, and the INFJ is an excellent painter, right? And but we need other skills, and the INFJ just spends too much time or energy perfecting their painting because it means a lot to them. They're gonna the INTJ is gonna be frustrated by that. So that's a point I've noticed, is that INTJs, while they have high standards and they value excellence, it's somewhat of a progressive thing. So excellence is, they acknowledge that excellence is an ideal and something that you work towards. It's not a finite goal that you achieve with the first stroke. And so that can really annoy the INTJ, I've noticed. The INFJ is going to be a lot more sensitive to the delivery over the content. So how you say things to an INFJ can affect them more than the stuff you say. And The INTJ, who is not always mindful of their mood or their current emotional state, their level of irritability, can sometimes unleash a lot of subtle negativity towards the INFJ when they're giving feedback. If they're preoccupied, they may just be really terse in their communication and not personal, and because they're busy and they're trying to be efficient. And the sensitivity and generally what the INTJ expects is that if there's an established relationship, that there's trust and that they mean well. So intentions matter to the INTJ more than how things are wrapped. So the sugarcoating is not really that important for the INTJ. And as such, the motto here is what is said is more important than how I say it, right? Okay. The INTJ is gonna sort of criticize the INFJ's impracticality, in a sense that, and generally I would think that INTJs don't really care that much about other people, but they're able to see the potential that the INFJ has. They can see that the INFJ has the skills and the temperament and the knowledge to execute on their vision. So there's a certain impatience that the INTJ kind of carries when they're helping an INFJ think through some of the problems. And it has to do with that the INFJ tends to sort of reason through a sandbox of introverted thinking where it's essentially isolated from the practical concerns around them. So the INTJ is always going to just be aware of things like budget and financial constraints and people and time and energy. So they really want to help the INFJ if they care, but the disregard for practical concerns is going to be a little too annoying for the INTJ. All right, one more thing is unwillingness to stand up for self, and this has to do with being overly agreeable, which is something that a lot of INFJs have. I've actually seen it more with male INFJs than female INFJs, but that could be that I'm sort of adjusting my standards based on gender. I'm not really sure, but there's the INTJ is going to be a lot more, a lot ready to. They're going to be very defensive if someone criticizes them unjustly, and they have a somewhat of a, let's just say, slightly overinflated ego, and so they don't really, if they feel like a person is mistreating them, they're likely to sort of confront it head on. They're not going to be doormats. People aren't going to push them over easily, and they're going to dwell. And finally, the INFJ is going to be frustrated that the INFJ dwells on abstracted problems. So a good example of this would be there's like a project and there was this one bug or one situation that really took a long time to fix. The INTJ is gonna sit on that idea, digest it, think through it, and it's gonna be very. They may even form an identity around it, and they're gonna, the INTJ is just gonna be frustrated by the hyper focus on that one thing, and the general tendency towards abstraction. Okay, the things that annoy the INFJ about the INTJ is the reality testing laser shoot down. So this happened to me a few times where an INFJ brings up an idea, and I know from the get-go that they're not going to do it, and that it's just a mere intellectual exercise. And I've accidentally sort of done reality testing as they're delivering their idea to me, and they don't appreciate that feedback because their thinking kind of functions in a sandbox of sorts where it's essentially very pure and isolated from reality-based sort of sensory concerns. So the fact that INTJs are always testing their ideas against reality, against feasibility, budget, practicality, all these things, it can be a little draining for the INFJ who just wants to ideate. Sometimes they see value in just thinking about ideas. The INFJ is going to find the INTJ unnecessarily abrasive. So if you have two equally competent managers, one being INTJ and the other being INFJ, assuming you can attain equal competence in any sort of measurable way, the INFJ is going to essentially effectively communicate the same content over a longer period of time with less abrasiveness. So the unskilledness of the lack of tact on behalf of the INTJ can really frustrate the INFJ because they can see how they're sort of adding to the collective emotional harmony. And if they're not contributing to it, it can directly affect the INFJ. So if an INTJ comes in and complains about a problem that everyone's aware of, but everyone's sort of trying to push behind, or there's a proper channel for it, if the INTJ does not appreciate these social protocols, it can sort of frustrate the INFJ. The INFJ is likely to think that the INTJ is closed-minded. And this has to do with the fact that INTJs have a very keen sense of their own abilities and what they can do. So from their childhood, with every project that they've worked on, they're essentially forming a self-image of their competence. So if they think that they're not going to be able to execute on an idea, they can just instantly disqualify it. They're not going to have these sort of fantastical. So the INTJ may not really engage in these sort of fantastical journeys about all these things that people want to do for humanity or what have you. If they feel like they're not going to do it, they think it's a waste. So whatever the seriousness comes from the fact that if they think they're not at the level they need to be, then they think that idea is bad. So they're going to focus on constraints and really the negative elements of a situation a lot more than the INFJ would. The INFJ is a lot more likely to align with ideas than with ideals, like shared social ideals, than the INTJ. Um, so this kind of carries with it like a sense of pessimism when it comes to problems. All right. Um, Disruptive to group dynamics. What this means is that if in cases where someone's being mistreated, the INFJ is likely to stand up. It seems almost as if the INFJ is more likely to stand up for someone else than themselves. I've noticed that dynamic. So if someone's being bullied, they may defend them, but they're not necessarily aware when it's kind of happening to them as much, at least. But they don't like that the INTJs can be disruptive to group dynamics. And this could be even in the most subtle forms where, let's say, an INTJ walks into a meeting and a bunch of people are talking about a wedding they attended over the weekend. If the INTJ suddenly shifts the topic to the matter at hand, that can be, even though it's necessary for the job, it can sort of disrupt an emotional play that was kind of going on. And an INFJ will find that a bit annoying. Even though the INTJ comes across as very well thought out, a lot of these ideas that INTJs have are actually sort of improvisational. I found they're very good at sort of doing heuristic based thinking, but it's not as thorough or detailed as an INFJ. So a lot of INTJs can sort of get the gist of an idea and just kind of work with it. They don't need to understand everything about it. So a good example of that would be an INTJ may be a little bit careless about the tactics of a situation and focus too much on strategy. What that means is they may just go for a ready-at-hand solution instead of a perfect one or a better one. And so the INFJ will sort of disrespect the inherent laziness in finding quick, satisfying sort of adequate solutions to problems that could be solved a lot better if you just were a little bit more deliberate about it. And the INFJ is also going to cut through the veil of this sort of aura of intellectual superiority that INTJs tend to project somewhat unconsciously, because they're a good way to think about it is INTJs are very process oriented and INFJs are very thought process oriented. So within being an INTJ, they can try to look for the internal logic and they may not find a good one, or they may find it lacking, and they can sometimes see a little bit of a tactical short-sightedness with the INTJ's approach to problems. And in this sense, they can sort of see each other's weaknesses, and the INFJ is going to think that the INTJ's thinking is a little too concrete, and the INFJ is going to think that the INFJs are too abstract and not down to earth enough. So that's basically a very lengthy summary of the differences between these two types. All right, final slide, tips for the INTJ on how to better work with INFJs and vice versa. I'll start with the INTJ. So for the INTJ, my number one tip would be don't rock the boat too hard, and learn from the INFJ that there are ways to get what you want without using so much brute force and brute language and brute argumentation. The INFJ is going to be a little bit more political and diplomatic in their approach to convincing others about their ideas. And the INTJ, somewhat naively expects that just laying down arguments in a detailed point-by-point fashion is going to have an effect. And when it doesn't, it can sort of cause the INTJ to let's just say bring in more negative energy than is absolutely necessary into an environment. So learning that one skill, I think, will help the INTJ work with INFJs quite a bit. That seems to be the most pointy issue between the two. All right, the second one for the INTJ is just be more normal. This sounds kind of obvious, but the indifference of the INTJ to social norms and conventions and all of these things that they sort of think are arbitrary and hyper local. So I had one INTJ coworker who would fart in the middle of meetings, and she would just do it very casually, and it caused a lot of discomfort in the team because everyone knew it was her, but she really didn't care. She didn't see what was wrong with flatulence. It's a natural biological thing, and a lot of INTJs can sometimes just dismiss social norms because they think they're irrelevant or stupid or unnecessary or distractions. And that can make them unnecessary enemies. Like it basically puts them at a social disadvantage. And it's really easy for the INTJ to just not do that. Just conform. And if their introverted feeling is kind of pointed against their social environment, this can be really hard. But part of maturing is just adapting to some things you don't like, and that'll just make your life easier in the long run. And it'll make you a little bit more palatable towards, I guess, for INFJs and most feeling types in general. All right. The third one is a general point for INTJs. Working with anyone, regardless of the person's type, is avoid giving unsolicited feedback. Even though it generally comes from a good place, different people need all kinds of emotional, different sets of emotional preparation to receive feedback. And the sort of spontaneous, uninvited feedback comes from a very benevolent place can actually make people uncomfortable. So just avoid giving unsolicited feedback. And, it's fine to ask someone if, to reach out to you if they're looking for feedback. But I've noticed that the FJs and NTPs, the NFJs and NTPs, generally do not welcome unsolicited feedback, and they would prefer to do it in a sort of proper channel as opposed to just spontaneously. The fourth point is make room for some impractical ideation. So there's some gold in the dirt whenever you're talking to people, whatever type they may be, and they're sharing their ideas with you. It's okay to just let them have, let them work with faulty premises, and just look for the internal consistency of their ideas, and you may find some gold there, right? So this will generally help you a lot with highly creative people, but mostly NFJs, NFPs, because they don't like to. They're not ready yet for the reality testing part. They just want to have an unconstrained brainstorming session sometimes, or they just want to exercise their imagination. And the INTJ's reality testing and seriousness is going to be a real social Debbie Downer. All right. Fifth point, be generous with positive feedback and affirmations. This is something I've had to work on. One of the things that happens to me quite often is that I sometimes observe that some of my coworkers are doing a good job, and I just reach out to them and tell them good job, and they come back to me with this surprise and extreme gratitude, and they tell me it means a lot, and they qualify it by saying, especially coming from you. And that's something that I've had to learn, is that people tend to give positive feedback quite regularly, even when there's not anything I guess extremely impressive to justify it. And so learning to be generous with positive feedback and affirmation is sort of like putting out a pulse, letting your teammates know that you still are involved and you still care to some extent. And this is going to seem unnatural, and it's not going to feel comfortable, but this is going to make it easier for you to work with INFJs. And then finally, respecting emotional transactions. Now, this is a tricky thing for me, and I haven't perfected it, obviously. But one thing that I've learned is the NFJs generally think of favors as somewhat transactional. So if someone gets you a gift, for example, you're expected to give something back. If someone remembers your birthday, it would be nice if you remember theirs too. And so a lot of these sort of like normal things that happen outside of work and social life kind of carry over in the workplace. So sometimes, even when it comes to technical decisions, the INFJ may side with you on an issue or may help you in some way, and they may expect that you will have their back. And I guess this is how extroverted feeling works. And so it's easy for INFJs to think that you're forming alliances with them or something if you just do something kind, just out of the goodness of your heart, or because you feel like it, or you're having a good day. So a lot of these emotional things that people do, especially INFJs, I've learned, have a transactional quality to them. And this is as opposed to, let's just say, INFPs who just do things because it makes them feel good and aligns with their values. All right. Now it's time for tips for the INFJ. The first one is tolerate temporary disruptions to group harmony. Sometimes the elephant in the room can grow so big that it eventually crushes you. And essentially, a lot of times, it's hard for INFJs to sort of bring up problems because they have this deep desire to remain liked, and people don't generally like to hear about problems. So when there's any kind of disharmony, so for example, let's say a coworker they like is making mistakes, and they're a very nice person and they're very agreeable, but some of the work they're doing is of poor quality and it's affecting the team, and everybody knows about it. In a situation like that, the INTJ may be a little bit more explicit about mentioning the problem, whereas the INFJ, who doesn't want to hurt the person's feelings or doesn't like to see the dynamics of the team change, may be more reluctant to sort of mention it, or they may over sugarcoat it or something like that. And it's important to understand that sometimes there are factors at work that are larger than team dynamics and people's emotions. And so even if they can't practice that, I think if they understand that perspective, it'll be much easier for them to sort of appreciate the bluntness that INTJs sometimes wear. Okay, focusing on impersonal systems. So the INFJ kind of has an intellectual powerhouse. They can, if they develop their thinking, I think that they can really grow into a person who's very balanced when it comes to human and non-human systems, which would make them excellent leaders and CEOs and stuff. But they have a tendency to sort of look at situations from an empathetic point of view first, and then it seems like the systems part, the interactions between the different components, the function of people as these sort of cogs in the machine, right? They kind of lose sight of the society that they're living in, the nature of capitalism, how the business operates, how finance works, how the law works. They can kind of forget these things sometimes, and be overly focused on just human dynamics. And if they have a better understanding of these sort of brute facts of how the world works and really accepting it. So I think understanding it comes easy, but accepting it is probably going to be harder for the INFJ. But if they can sort of accept it and really align with the, I guess, open their eyes to the systems they're working in, then they really don't run into a lot of the contradictions that hold them back. And so I would encourage the INFJ to focus on understanding impersonal, non-human factors that sort of influence how businesses operate, how the economy works, how value is created, how products work, and just kind of forget the human element for a little bit. That'll give you a unique set of skills and a unique perspective. Okay, third point. Establish healthy channels for receiving and giving feedback. What this means is you can put yourself at a disadvantage if you are too sensitive, right? This would apply to anyone who's too agreeable, but generally, you need both positive and negative feedback in order to learn and grow. In a situation where everybody is nice to you and everybody is not giving you honest enough advice because they are afraid of offending you, you're not going to grow as much. And so, in a sense, it's important to sort of create a way for people who maybe INTJ or a different type that's more thinking, and they care about you, but they want to give you feedback. So you need to sort of explicitly lay out what the protocol is and how you prefer to receive it, if you are interested in feedback. The fourth point is related to the second point, but this is about constraining the thinking to sort of external girders of reality. And what this means is that a lot of times INFJs can get stuck working on a problem, and they may miss deadlines, they may not finish on time, they may start a lot of projects and abandon some of them. They always have a lot of ideas, but a lot of them tend to be impractical, and they sometimes lack the energy to sort of execute on all of them. But a common thing, a common pattern I've observed is that they tend to disregard the sort of constraints that, or the problems. So in a sense, they're so quick to abstract the problem into a puzzle that they sort of leave out the actual concrete pain surrounding it. And if they can kind of focus on that, and this actually works well with their empathy. So like, let's say they're working on a product. If they can understand why a person is using that product, who the person is, they're going to be a little bit more driven, and they're going to have a little bit more energy towards finishing that. They're going to have an easier time converting their high-level solutions into concrete tasks that they can then check off linearly. And then finally, learn to self-evaluate and self-promote. People can really take advantage of the INFJ's agreeableness. So some of their coworkers who may be in somewhat of a zero-sum game, competition scenario with them, may not really give them positive feedback because it's in their self-interest to not have them promoted. And since these situations exist, the INFJ can be naive towards these things, so it's important to learn to self-evaluate and promote yourself.